Hey everyone, we're going to finish off chapter 19 really quickly here. The second half is pretty simple. So remember, in the first half we looked at how the assumptions for science have to be taken from a biblical worldview. So remember the three assumptions that first of all, nature is orderly, that we can actually study it. Second, that man senses actually work, so what we see and the way we think can actually accurately describe what is around us. And then finally, that we have the right to do that, that's given to us by God. All three of those have to be taken from the Christian worldview. Now in this second section, 19.2, we're going to be talking about the two major purposes for science. And then the last section, we're going to be talking about some scientific norms in 19.3. So the tools of science are marvelous because they show us how great God is. It starts off the chapter talking about astronauts, and as they go into space and look back, they just see how incredibly well designed the earth is, and that gives them a desire to worship God. Advanced optics and increasingly sensitive and accurate instruments allow us to look closer, listen harder, and even feel more keenly the truths God has placed in His creation, using things like microscopes and telescopes, even night vision goggles and sound microphones, things like that, enable us to really study creation in more detail and see how incredibly intricate and well designed it is. So as we study creation more and more, we see more and more how well designed it is and how little evidence there is for a godless, materialistic, evolutionary view of the universe. So here's a quick quote: "Science is a God-created good because nature is meant to be, among other things, a path to the Creator." So the first thing that we have for science is that science is used to glorify God. And the better we understand the world around us, the more we'll be able to glorify God. But the second reason we want to study science is to be able to help other people. So the first major purpose of science fits together with the greatest commandment, to love God with all of our heart. The more we understand His creation, the more we'll be amazed by His power, and the more we'll be able to worship Him and glorify Him. That's what Psalm 19 talks about, with the heavens declare the glory of God. And talks about the sun and the earth and how all those things point to God. But the second commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And the better we understand the world around us, the better we'll be able to serve our neighbor, the better we'll be able to help others. So the second major purpose is making wise use of the world of your neighbor. So loving God and love your neighbor are the ultimate purposes of every academic discipline and cultural domain, not just of science. So when you study literature or history or English or math, you should be studying those things, number one, to glorify God better, and number two, to be able to help other people with that knowledge. So your love for God and others must fuel your work, or else your science, no matter how much good it does, will be ultimately immoral. So if you just do science for the sole purpose of promoting yourself or making money, and you don't have any desire to help others, that science will be. All right, continuing on with 19.3, we talked about the two major purposes for science: to glorify God more as we understand His creation more, and then secondly, to help other people with our knowledge of science. And now, just like we talked about norms for other areas of our life, we talked about norms for gender and marriage, we talked about norms for government. A lot of those norms that we've talked about so far have come directly from the Bible. For example, the Bible tells us specifically how marriage is supposed to be, or how gender is supposed to be, and it even gives us at least some general principles about how government is supposed to be. But just like we talked about when we first talked about norms, a lot of the norms actually don't come directly from the Bible, but come from us using the abilities God has given us to study the world around us. So most of these norms do not come directly from the Bible, but instead come from the wisdom that God gives us to be able to study the world around us. So since it's part of the created structure of the cosmos and it is governed by creational norms, which are the laws that God built into His creation. Wisdom is one of God's key aspects of creation, and so God is the one who teaches us. And even if it's using the world around us or our senses, God is the one that's using to teach us. So wisdom is the first principle of the world and the pattern by which. So there are 5 creational norms. Number 1 is organized empirical study. What this means is that humans need to perform organized empirical study of the created order in order to find ways to maximize its universe, its usefulness. So in order to use the world around us to help other people, for example, if I want to figure out what is causing the coronavirus and find a cure or a treatment for it, I have to study the virus. I have to study the people that have it. I have to study the animals that it came from. I have to study the virus itself under a microscope. And I need to do that in an empirical way, which is simply using my senses, my hearing, my sight, my touch, my taste. And it's also in an organized way. The more organized I am, the better I will be able to understand the information. So empirical means just using the five senses. Empirical truths then are the ones you get by observation or experience. So the first norm is I need to study it using my senses and using organization. Once I've learned about it, then in order to understand what is going on, I need to make a model. So for example, again with the coronavirus, I make a model about how I believe the coronavirus is spread, how I believe the coronavirus affects someone, and what are some ways I can be used to stop that. So we call this model making. God's word is what defines reality at its most ultimate level. It's that word that gives order to the creation. So that's our only ultimate source of truth. As we study the world around us, we can come up with models, but those models are going to be constantly changing. For example, the more, again, we learn about the coronavirus, the more we're going to change what we thought before, the more we're going to realize this works, this doesn't work. They're going to go through changes. And especially when we have a major change, we call that a paradigm shift. So it talks about a philosopher who came up with this idea of paradigm shifts. And basically, if you look over the history of science, for example, with the solar system, there was a period of time when we thought the Earth was the center. And that seemed to make sense. It seemed to work. But the more information we got, the more that we had to come up with really complex explanations to explain how what we observe fits with that model, until finally we said this model must not work well enough, so we had to come up with a new model. And the more, every time we come up with a new model, it's not necessarily better. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's just different. But the more we learn, many times the more problems a model has, and then we're going to have to come up with a new model. And we've seen this in physics, we've seen this in chemistry with the atom. The more information we learn, then we have to change our paradigm, and that's how science is. So the model will never give us ultimate truth. So not all the work of God is completely comprehensible to us. We're never going to be able to understand everything. But these models just give us the ability to organize and try to understand information. They set the rules about how we're going to study it and give us the questions that we need to keep studying. But we have to realize it's subject to change. The third norm is communication. Once we've studied through an empirical organized method, once we have then made a model based on that study and are updating that model, we need to share that information with other people. The more people we get involved, the better we're going to be able to learn, and the better we're going to be able to understand the world around us. So we have to communicate. So the work of science relies on the work of communication. So this is why they have scientific journals, where once someone has tested a theory, they put that theory in a journal. Then a lot of other scientists can test that as well in different conditions, under different circumstances, and either verify, yes, this theory seems to work, this model seems to work, or say, no, you did this wrong, so this doesn't work. So they make documents and write books for the general public. Many times these can be very boring and seem useless, but that doesn't mean we should stop doing them, and just means we should do a better job in writing them and realize the importance of the studies that are done in these journals. But communication with other scientists and with the general public will be a big benefit to be able to pool our resources. Fourth norm is standardization. If we're communicating, especially with people in other countries, and they're using completely different units and completely different theories, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for us to share information. So standardization basically makes information the same across the board, units the same, so then we can easily share information without having problems. So for human beings to make use of each other's work, we need to have standardization. This is just using international standards. That's a humble recognition that the creation mandate isn't just for us in the United States, it's for everyone. So for example, if in the United States we use feet and in the rest of the world they use meters, it's going to be difficult to be constantly switching between those. So it's easier if in the scientific community, which even in the United States, even though common people use feet, in the scientific community they would use meters and the international standard. So we need each other, and we need to really fourth norm. Our final norm is that there is no truth without goodness and beauty. One of the clearest examples of this was during World War II, when the Nazis and the Japanese used a lot of scientific research, but they did it in a very grotesque and evil way. So science must stay within moral and ethical boundaries. The pursuit of truth becomes a lie if it takes a shortcut past goodness. So using humans and experimenting on humans is never acceptable. Killing thousands of people to come to the truth of science is never acceptable. So scientific truth isn't worth having at all costs. Some is too high. So what is science? The definition you can see here: collection of observations, explanations, and models produced through an organized study of nature for the purpose of enabling people to exercise good and wise dominion over God's world for the glory of God and the good of mankind. Science is a very good thing. Remember, this whole first chapter is about how God created it to be. It's a biblical calling, and it's a God